SEP Fanfic Readings presents Measure of a Man by Days 22. Chapter 5. Granger. April 2nd, 2011. The greenhouse itself was not green. It was a homemade hut made of glass, wood, and metal framing. Crafted with extendable charms, the outside wasn't imposing, quaint enough to blend in the scenery around her vegetable patch. The inside, however, was spacious with room to grow. A pathway led through the rich foliage. Some plants were potted, some were mounted on trellises, and some even hung from the ceiling, but everything was bursting with color. Organized and spaced out into sections, Hermione had a method to the way she arranged her plants. Fruit trees in the back, certain flowers in the middle, vegetables that wouldn't survive outdoors dotted between, and an ever-expanding selection of individual pots on tables that housed herbs needed to brew her potions. The empty table served as a reminder of its status as a work in progress. But maybe one day it would house every herb imaginable. Until then, she used what she had to make a difference in her own way. The sun was out, but there was a chill in the air from an easterly wind. High clouds softened the light and prevented any harsh shadows from forming. Inside the greenhouse was warm and lush, like spring, thanks to natural light and temperature control charms. Hermione shed her jumper the moment she entered, placing it on a bench next to the door. Hermione flicked her wrist, and water sprouted over her fruit trees while she contemplated adding a dwarf mango to the mix of pears, lemons, figs, and the latest addition, oranges. The kids would like that. After filing it away for further consideration, Hermione moved over to checking the flowers, fruits, and vegetables before turning her attention to the main reason she'd started the greenhouse, the herbs, particularly the ones for potions. Her first stop was the Dietary plants, which had been on the brink of death for the last year. That was the main reason for her current attempt to grow another, which stubbornly remained in the windowsill of her office, refusing to sprout. Today it still looked grim, but resilient. Neville would probably have to take it to his greenhouse for better rehabilitation. Nettle was next, but she was careful around it, tending to it with impenetrable dragonhide gloves. Asphodel, leaping toadstools, neem, and wormwood all looked good. The aconite plants had their own table, and had grown to 20 since Daphne had started collecting them for Hermione over the last 3 years so that she could brew wolfsbane for Padma's patients. They were thriving, mainly due to Neville's efforts, teachings, and special fertilizer. Hermione had just finished watering them when the doors parted and Daphne walked in. Right behind her was Neville, who was carrying her latest procurement. Always a gentleman. "Arca!" Hermione stopped, fully focused on their approach. When Neville stopped beside her, she reverently touched the leaves of the plant with her gloved hand. It was a wonderful addition that would help create potions to ease the pain from the Cruciatus curse. It was also an ingredient in several of Narcissa's potions. She hadn't asked for it, but the timing couldn't be more perfect. "Where did you find it?" Daphne gave a small smile. "At George's birthday extravaganza last night. A birdie told me that you have a new patient, and Arca is an ingredient in a few of their potions." Hermione astutely cut her eyes to Neville, the only person who would have known about her need for certain ingredients because she'd raided his greenhouse before the party. He just whistled innocently before giving her a crooked smile that she returned. Daphne laughed. "The birdie came with me to pick it up. Where are you going to put it?" She had several empty tables for herbs, and she'd planned ahead for expansion, but before she could direct him, Neville picked out a spot on his own. "We should give it some space to start with." He took it to the last table on the row. Hermione turned to Daphne. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing. That was all good timing. I always let Neville know when I acquire a plant in a deal. Just happened to be your lucky day that the owner died, and I was able to negotiate—" "Oh!" Daphne went into her pocket, pulling out a small bag of dried herbs. "Kava, as requested." Something Hermione had needed as she used a small amount of it in her teas for new patients. It always helped settle their nerves. "But my seller wasn't willing to part with it or provide a clipping. It'll harm the plant, apparently." Which was fair. "Thanks." Hermione put the herb along with her wand into the pocket of her apron. "Blaise will be by later with the rest. He's tied up negotiating a rare painting for a client." The less she knew, the better, judging from the expression on Daphne's face. Daphne and Blaise had been partners in the business of procurement for longer than Hermione had been gardening. It had started as a pastime for both of them, but quickly became a career. Originally, Hermione thought it was an odd choice, but Daphne apparently had a knack for finding things. She'd found the almost extinct ingredients required to make the antidote for Molly, and had done it with time to spare. Their business wasn't just tracking down herbal rarities. They worked with private collectors of almost anything. From mazoologists seeking to rescue unusual magical creatures from illegal trade to ministries all over the world procuring rare, requested items. Daphne generally left the practical work to Blaze and their underlings while she focused on less complex finds and researching what they were looking for, especially since she'd found out she was pregnant. Neville examined the aqua plant and took a sample of the soil before returning to them. It's extremely healthy, better than I noticed at first glance. Hermione cast another look over his shoulder at the plant. We can let it settle for a week or two and then repot it. It'll need to be in the exact same quality soil so it doesn't ruin the plant. How long before I can prepare it myself? A month? I found what you needed in the meantime, Daphne said before the initial tickle of worry could form. After all, she had spent the last 2 days working on her potions alone, and the thought of missing pieces tingled her anxiety. Blaze will bring it by with everything else you've ordered. Excellent. First problem handled. It was decent enough outside, in that it wasn't raining or too windy, so they grabbed blankets and snacks and ventured out into the field behind her house. Hermione quickly transfigured a weed into the ugliest mustard-yellow sofa she'd ever seen, but after exchanging shrugs with Daphne, they both lounged on opposite ends under a shared blanket, their shoes nearly touching. Neville, meanwhile, had spread the blanket out on the grass in front of them and laid on his back, with his hands behind his head. Hermione cast a quick warming charm on him. They stayed like that for nearly an hour, enjoying the strange peace they'd found out in the field as they passed around the bag of crisps. Ultimately, there was a silent agreement to let Daphne eat the majority of them. She was eating for 2, after all. "Where's Luna?" Hermione asked. Usually she came with Neville whenever he came by. "Clearing nargles from Harry's house. Apparently there's another infestation." "Ah. Tell her I said thank you for the gifts for the baby, but I don't think she got the color right," Daphne chuckled. "Pretty certain I'm having a boy." They wanted to find out a little closer to her due date, which didn't seem practical to Hermione, who thought things like preparation and names were important. Not like it mattered. Everyone thought they were having a boy anyway. Something about the way she was carrying, but Hermione was no expert. Luna firmly believed that she was carrying a girl. In fact, her belief ran so deep that while they were all coming up with masculine names at girls' night last night, she only came up with one. Halia. "In remembrance of a loved one," she had said. Definitely more fitting than Cho's dull suggestion of Paul. That made Pansy stare at her as if she were an escaped mental patient. Neville shrugged. "Maybe you are having a girl." "Of course you'd agree with your girlfriend." Daphne shook the bag of crisps and sighed after realizing they were all gone. "You both ate them all." He lifted his head up, ready to argue the contrary, but Hermione caught his eye and shook her head. Best if he didn't. There had been actual tears when Parvati loudly marveled at the fact that Daphne had eaten 2 bags of crisps in one sitting. "I'm sorry about that. I'll make lunch?" "I suppose I could eat, but will there be pie?" "I can make that happen." Daphne, who hadn't been able to eat much during the first 3 months of her pregnancy, genuinely looked excited. Neville chuckled to himself and laid back down. "Oh, I'm going to start Kingsley's bee garden." Hermione perked up at that, while Daphne raised a confused eyebrow. "I'm looking into getting the plants right now, and I also need to pick from my students who volunteered as soon as they'd heard it was for him." "Understandable." Daphne shrugged before Hermione could say anything. "If it's for Kingsley, let me know if you need Blaze and I to find you anything." And they both looked at her. The witch just shrugged. "What? I like him. If he were the minister again, I wouldn't oppose." There was an entire underground movement dedicated to making that happen. "Well, if there's anything I need, I'll let you know." Neville sat up, crossing his legs at the ankles as he leaned back on his hands, breeze blowing through his hair. Then he turned towards Hermione after a measured silence. "So, your new patient?" Daphne perked up. "Yeah, what made you change your mind? Pansy said you'd refused her." "How badly did she talk about me?" The blonde said nothing, but her look spoke tomes. Hermione winced. "That bad?" The long look continued until Daphne rolled her eyes. "The phrase, stubborn bitch, was thrown around a few times, but I think she meant it in a loving way." "Doubtful." But she offered an awkward shrug and smile anyway, before it transformed into something more resigned. "She respects Narcissa for reasons I don't understand, but that may be my bias speaking." "Your sister and your nephew?" Hermione asked automatically. "Yes, and Draco." Neville's eyebrows went up even higher than hers. "Malfoy?" Daphne's side sounded exactly like Harry when he was preparing to launch into a Malfoy-inspired rant. She had one chance to pass a glance at Neville to try and change the trajectory of the conversation, but found the man intrigued instead. She treated my sister like a placeholder, just waiting for her to die so she could find someone better to take her place as the next Malfoy matriarch. The disgust in her voice drew Hermione in rather than repelled her. This was pertinent to learning a little more about the dynamic she was walking into. So far, it wasn't pretty. Not a surprise. I've already given my word about treating her. Hermione wouldn't change her mind because of their friendship. This was work and Narcissa was a patient in her care. And I'd never come between that with my opinions. I may not like her. I may find her slowly dying horribly ironic because of how she treated my sister. She shook her head ruefully. But for Scorpius not to lose someone else so quickly, I'm willing to put my feelings aside. Spoken like someone who loved him absolutely. Family. I can't save her. I'm only slowing the progress, or trying to. I'm working out the details. Those details involved putting a lot of pieces together, potions and ingredients, taking pages from the treatment methods Narcissa had rejected, figuring out the family dynamic to determine just how useful, or difficult, Draco Malfoy would be when it came to his mother's care. When Hermione looked again, she found Daphne's blue eyes fixed on her, full of emotion so vivid and complex that no words existed to describe them. Whatever happens, for what it's worth, I'm glad it's you. There was nothing Hermione could say in response. When she lowered her eyes to the hideous, colorful blanket that kept her warm, Daphne continued her story. As far as Astoria goes, my grievances run deep. Having Scorpius didn't change her relationship with Narcissa, but it appeased her. I think, gave her someone else to focus on. That didn't sound like a good thing. Draco was busy and did what he could, and Astoria tried. She handled as much of Scorpius's care for as long as she was able until Narcissa took over with her silly rules, rigorous schedule, training, and expectations. He's 5. Hermione trailed off, frowning. You've met Scorpius? Briefly. It wasn't a very memorable interaction. In fact, Hermione hadn't thought about it too much in the hours and days since. However, now that it was coming into focus again, there had been a few things she'd picked up on. Okay, several. And what did you think? He's very well-mannered and obedient. Seems oddly perceptive. Hermione tried to recall the boy from Theo's office. Oh, and very quiet. Everything Narcissa thinks he should be, except one thing. A child. Well, now that she mentioned it, there was one more thing Hermione recalled. I don't think I heard him utter a word. And you won't. Daphne sounded almost brittle. He doesn't speak. Can't? Neville's question was intended to correct her statement. No, won't. She emphasized with a sharp movement of her hand. He's shy around strangers, of course, but he used to talk incessantly around family, and about 3 months before my sister died, it's like he realized what was happening and just shut down. One day he just stopped. Grief would do that, especially in a child. Daphne ran a roughed hand through her hair, trying to keep herself under control by focusing on the discussion at hand. Having nothing to offer, Hermione pressed the sole of her shoe against Daphne's in silent support, which drew her attention momentarily, and she was rewarded with an appreciative look. Pressing a flat hand against her bump, Daphne looked to the nearby forest, to the trees that swayed in the breeze. Watching him shut down was distressing to Astoria. Daphne shook her head. I promised to keep a close eye on him, but... Her unkempt promise lingered all around them, resting heavy on her shoulders. Hermione watched as she continued weathering the storm of her emotions, each wave of it stronger than the last, more brutal. Daphne tried to tread water, but couldn't. She sank into the depths of honesty. It's been hard since... She took a deep breath, voice quieter when she confessed. He hardly looks at me. It's almost like he can't. Give him time, Neville suggested. My parents are still alive, and sometimes it's hard to... Neville fell silent, staring up at the sky. His lost words left a residue behind that made the air heavy with the weight of sadness, collective pain, and loss. The latter, Hermione knew, came in so many shapes that it was difficult to distinguish one from the other, or rank them in order of magnitude. But at the same time, hope still lingered. People carried their struggles in hundreds of forms and in different ways, mostly in silence, but it was amazing how some were able to reach out with ease, not only in help, but in solidarity. And Neville did just that, had been doing just that from time to time since Astoria died, despite them not being very close before. He rested his hand palms up on the sofa next to Daphne, and in a show of ever-increasing trust, she accepted his support. "Give him time," Neville repeated. "How much?" "As long as he needs." Time passed like that. A second, 10 minutes. It all went by in a blur of thoughts and internal musings. Somewhere in between, Daphne let go of Neville's hand, and he went back to watching the clouds in the sky. It probably wasn't the time, but there was a question niggling at her. Hermione bit her fingernail to try and coax the words back, but they came anyway. "I understand how you would be biased about your sister and nephew, but why Malfoy?" Then Hermione drew the blanket up around her neck, catching the chill in the air despite the warming charms imbued in the fabric. The blonde opposite of her wasn't as cold, likely heated from within based on the fire in her eyes. "Draco's actions, or inactions, directly affect Scorpius. He's so closed up, even from Scorpius. I'm not sure he even knows how damaging the emotional distance he keeps is. He doesn't talk to me about his reasons, or anything really. Furthermore, Draco is a product of his upbringing and journey. It's hard for me to look at Narcissa and not blame her for both of them." April 4th, 2011. Hermione read somewhere that the secret to successful negotiations was finding common ground and acting as an observer rather than the opposition. Reason with them, but never issue a threat. The best way to win was to find the information needed, lay out the options, and present the situation with a healthy dose of poise and logic. It reminded her of all the wizard's chess lessons Ron had given her, lessons she remembered well while weaving in and out of the ministry's political maze. He never took mercy on her. Each time they played, he would repeat that the key to winning was to always think several moves ahead, and only sacrifice pieces she knew she could live without. There were two problems with that way of thinking. One, Hermione was absolute pants at chess, and two, she was far too stubborn to sacrifice any of her pieces. And that was why she and Narcissa were sitting in a silence that threatened to multiply and envelope themselves like the dust of a storm. But it didn't scare her one bit. Hermione was on her third cup of tea, while the other witch was just finishing her second, a minty blend that she seemed to enjoy. Under the orders of her son and their boss, her guards were not allowed to take their eyes off their charge at any given time during the appointment, so they had each taken a corner in her office. One of them was swaying on his feet, while the other was admiring the young obsidian shrivelfig in the corner that wasn't quite ready to go into the greenhouse. She allowed her eyes to drift back to Narcissa as she took another sip. It hadn't been such a terrible appointment thus far. They'd both started by signing the original agreement. Hermione had carefully read it over, and Percy had given his stamp of approval last night over dinner, as he did with all of her legal documents. Of course, he made suggestions for changes that would maximize the benefits for Hermione, but she hadn't added anything. The salary was already astronomical, and she wanted little else except for weekends and halls off. The deal had also come with Narcissa's staff of private palliative care healers, and Hermione reminded herself to schedule a meeting with them as soon as possible. Just to bring them on board with her plan, as soon as she completed her creation of it. For the first time in her career, Hermione Granger was improvising. According to Charles, there wasn't an established treatment plan directly for Narcissa's dementia. They were treating symptoms rather than the source, which meant she had to be creative, find something effective, and hope for the best. His specialist seemed to have a plan in place where she could use without the addition of Muggle medicine. For now, it would have to do. Until she could convince Narcissa, or maybe even Malfoy, to bring in a specialist to assist. Hopefully sooner rather than later. Once the binding contract had been signed, Hermione had begun her work right away, running a battery of tests to establish her baseline. Cognitive and sensory tests were completed, both with and without the aid of magic. Accompanied by her guards, they took a long walk around the banks of the stream in front of her home, where Hermione tested her balance, reflexes, and strength through various methods that irritated the older witch, but she hadn't complained too much. When they were back in her office, Narcissa produced all of her potions, giving Hermione everything she needed to prepare her daily regimen, which they would discuss during the first home visit. Their current impasse had been reached when Hermione's request turned from Narcissa's potions to her calendar and her very, very full schedule. As it turned out, for someone who hadn't been part of London society for years, Narcissa Malfoy was a very busy woman. While blood status was still important to maintaining prestige in proper society, after the war, the upper echelon of the wizarding world social order had transformed, expanding to include a new group of people, affluent half-bloods and very influential Muggleborns, though the latter were only included as proof of their tolerance, their forward thinking, a sign of change. As Hermione had been preparing to move into politics, she had been to several events before her career change, but not so many since. The drop-off in invitations hadn't offended her, since she wasn't much for organized events anyway. That being said, Hermione had a vague but working knowledge of how society operated. She knew just how rigorous each season was with galas and glittering balls, charity and sporting events, magical garden shows and festivities, dinners and tea parties. It wasn't unheard of for there to be an activity every day for a solid month. When she told Narcissa to scale back on her plans for the current social season until everything with her potions was sorted, well, they had regressed back to the mean. Silence. Hermione was qualified, prepared, and resolved to outlast Narcissa in the prolonged stalemate, which ended up being more of a gift than a challenge. She had no idea how Narcissa occupied her thoughts during the impasse, but Hermione used her time wisely, laying out both a daily schedule for Narcissa to follow and working out the technicalities of her potions regime. For that, she'd need alone time with several potions books in her collection and possibly another fire call with Healer Smith. She was mentally calculating the time difference when she heard a throat clear, prim and high-pitched. She lifted her head from where her notes were spread across her desk. A single eyebrow arched as she met Narcissa's cool expression. "Yes?" It was intended to sound patient to the point where it bordered on condescending, judging from the way Narcissa's eyes sharpened to the shards of ice. Hermione had been right on target. "I'm willing to negotiate scaling back my activities, Miss Granger. However, I do not think you grasp that one's standing in society is more than simply wealth and influence. It is important to me that the future of my family, but I do not expect you to understand tradition." Hermione's jaw clenched. She wasn't under any delusions that they would become anything more than healer and patient during the course of her treatment, and that statements made the point very clear. Also, it meant that she had no problem speaking her mind in any way, shape, or form. Lovely. But also not surprising. Hermione could handle anything Narcissa threw at her. "You're correct. I don't understand," she said placidly, and Narcissa tilted her head. "However, my lack of knowledge has little to do with my blood status and more to do with the fact that you were gone for years from any society circles. Which makes it more imperative that I am seen. I'm sure your son can take your place at these events," Hermione suggested with a flourish of her hand. "I have no doubt that you've groomed and trained him well to be a perfectly respectable member of high society." She fixed the witch with a hard look. "You certainly raised him to believe himself superior to everyone because of nothing more than his family name and the purity of blood. I'm certain he'll fit right in." Narcissa bristled like a cat that had been splashed with cold water, but Hermione only maintained her even stare with her eyes on her patient. The expression on Narcissa's face was sharp, a testament to the fact that she'd struck a tender spot for the older witch. Perhaps a source of her shame. Interesting. She hadn't been aiming for it, but had hit it anyway. "I suppose I deserved that." "You did." Hermione didn't mince her words. "I know you're used to being spoken to in a certain manner, but for as long as I am able to, I'm here to take care of your body and preserve your mind as long as possible, not your feelings." She paused, allowing her words to sink in as she organized her next statement. "I think it should be stated right now that I will show you the same respect that you show me. I hope that we can come to some sort of understanding during my time as your healer." If she would have blinked, Hermione might have missed the slight furrowing of Narcissa's brows and only caught the look of calculation, followed by careful consideration on her face. "Perhaps we can—" It was enough. She laced her fingers together and placed her hands on the parchment strewn all over her desk. "Now, we were discussing diminishing your society activities in favor— Draco is simply not an option." Narcissa's tone made Hermione recoil as much as her words did. The divisive line had been drawn in the metaphorical sand. "He has little interest in society and thinks it is a waste of time." She was sure there was more than that, but Narcissa kept it to herself. Furthermore, Hermione didn't disagree with him on that front, but kept her face perfectly passive and trained on the older witch. Years spent embroiled in the ministry's politics had also improved her poker face exponentially, and she wore it well enough for Narcissa to continue speaking. Hermione noted both the sweat on her brow and the tiny tremble in her hand when she held her teacup and frowned. When his presence is required, Draco will attend, but he refuses to socialize with anyone. He will not dance, speak to, walk with, or even be seen shown any sort of attention to a single eligible witch, which would be the entire purpose of his attendance. Hermione's attention drifted to the silent duo of guards. One was looking at the abstract painting over her fireplace, and the other was yawning. She kept the amused smirk off of her face when she focused on her patient, who was still going on about her son. Draco is a widower and in need of a wife, but only when it is proper for him to take one again. That is what I am using this season to prepare for. I will not stand anyone speaking ill of him, at least not while I am still here with all of my faculties. It took every shred of self-control for Hermione not to roll her eyes. Unfortunately, my son is... There is something stirring in him that has been building since Astoria's death, and it will not be quieted. I am hoping to introduce him to someone of his liking before whatever it is going on with him comes into complete focus. The phrasing of her statement drew Hermione's attention like static electricity. Just a little jolt, then it was gone. The issue is timing. He attends the marriage dates that I arrange, not because he wants to, but purely out of the duty to his family. I'm afraid I am on a serious time constraint when it comes to his compliance, so I have been meeting various prospects at society events to arrange these dates. As you can see, Miss Granger, my presence is vital. Hermione took to drinking her tea in an attempt to swallow down each and every retort that tried to surface, but found herself out of tea and still rankled. Bothered by her words, her flippant tone. It wasn't her business. Really, it wasn't. Hermione chanted the phrase to herself repeatedly, but hell, she'd mentally overstepped so far that even when she tried to correct it, she still found herself careening off the side of a cliff into not her business territory, which was dangerous. So, for her own sake, as the thought would pester her relentlessly until it festered and she had to think about it, Hermione allowed it safe passage across the bridge of her mind, then locked it away with the hundreds of things she would never say. For starters, Astoria wasn't 6 months in the ground, and there she was, trying to marry Malfoy off again, but only when it was proper. Hermione pinched herself to stop the look of disgust from escaping. She didn't know enough about pure-blood culture to judge them for it. For all she knew, a quick second wife was their answer when a motherless child was involved. It seemed to be Narcissa's, but what did she know? Pansy had said that they arranged their marriages, sometimes from birth, so a new one wasn't exactly a far-fetched idea. Narcissa had said that they didn't want him to be alone after she was gone. But Jo was right. It just seemed cold, and Daphne's bitterness made more sense. Threats, a job that seemed almost like a personal mission, a deceased wife, a selectively mute son, dying mother. The circumstances of Draco Malfoy's life were stressful and complicated in a way that seemed painfully obvious to Hermione. Adding a newly contracted marriage, one born from force and not choice, seemed very much like throwing accelerant onto an inferno. It would burn out of control. Narcissa appeared willfully ignorant of the potential consequences of her actions. Likely out of sheer stubbornness, or perhaps acknowledging them wouldn't do her agenda any good. Which led right to her other thought. Regardless of the situation Malfoy found himself in following the death of his wife, perhaps if she didn't force a grown man to attend marriage dates like an errant bachelor, he might do it on his own, in his own time, in his own way, with the person of his choosing, if that were even allowed. Hermione didn't know, nor did she care, really. Feeling much better now that she'd let those thoughts run free, Hermione locked the door and threw away the key. She focused on her real objective. I'm reasonable and willing to negotiate. At that, Narcissa, who was idly toying with the ring around her neck, looked intrigued. I'll monitor you daily for the first few weeks, and you should go on as normal to establish a baseline under the new potions regime. However, you must keep your stress levels as low as possible while at these events. Also, you must take a day for yourself to mentally relax. Any day of the week you suffice. I'm not fussed about specifics. I personally suggest the spa, or perhaps taking up a new hobby that's not physically strenuous, but still mentally stimulating. Last, because I can only imagine how you exert yourself at these events, I'll attend to observe you, but stay out of the way. Only ones that I have been invited to as well, as I'm under the impression that your condition is a secret. Am I correct? You are, and I intend to keep it that way until I can no longer do so. Does Draco know? Because it would be hard to explain her presence if he didn't. He does, but... She trailed off, looking uncomfortable as her face grew somber, and a sigh accompanied her downward stare. Her hands were properly placed in her lap. Since you are likely to find out anyway, my relationship with my son is complicated. We live together in our family's home that he purchased after we returned from France, but I rarely see him unless it has something to do with Scorpius's care or our numerous discussions around the subject of his eventual marriage. For a myriad of reasons, we are not on the best of terms. I doubt he even cares about my illness. He has not inquired once about my health since I told him. Ah, that was all she could say on that front. Her actual answer, how unsurprising, wouldn't have been welcomed. She should have expected the added density to the situation. After all, she was dealing with the Malfoys. Hermione hadn't needed to know about the fractured state of Draco and Narcissa's relationship to recognize that she was sailing into stormy waters. But Hermione had a plan to skirt the outer edges of the storm, never allowing herself to get too close. She had all the time she needed to do just that. A sturdy boat, proper anchors, and a good moral compass should she need to find true north. She wasn't worried, secure in her resolve to care for Narcissa, and give her the time she wanted to fix what she had broken. And maybe work with Malfoy to figure out a plan for him further down the road. Are you available for a home visit? I'd like to see the setup to figure out if I'll need to use my own kitchen to prepare your meals. Meals? Narcissa didn't hide her skepticism. Yes, meals. Hermione pointedly ignored the look. I prepare meals for my patients, as I believe food heals, and with your condition, your diet is just as important as the potions I will prescribe. Well, perhaps the house elves and magic... I do not cook with magic, and I don't have a house elf. At that strong statement, the naked look of aghast bewilderment on the older witch's face was so comical that Hermione wondered if she'd ever eaten a meal not prepared by magic. Then how do you cook? There was suspicion in her eyes, as if she only started fires for cooking with twigs and flint rock. Primitive. In a kitchen, with recipes, measurements, and a cooker. Might use a knife. As far as food, I use ingredients from my own garden, and I bake my own bread with flour I purchase from a Muggle farmer near my home. If at all possible, the witch looked even more put off. Hermione continued as if she weren't looking so scandalized. I'd like to start you on a full diet, but I understand how difficult that will be, so I'll be willing to start you off with 1 meal a day and increase from there. Narcissa looked as if she were trying to feed her aconite. Why? Hermione unrolled the parchment that contained a summary of her research. It was a valid question, one that she had the right to know as it pertained to her health. There is much we don't know about your condition in those with magic, but with the Muggle version of your disease, research shows that maintaining a healthy diet is especially important. As you decline, your mood will change, as will what you want to eat, so malnutrition, weight loss, and dehydration may occur. She caught the way the witch flinched, and had to remember that, while she might have accepted her fate, discussing the inevitable would never be an easy topic. Hermione knew better, then smoothed her words out in a semblance of an apology, aiming more for comforting than clinical. I believe that the more aggressive we are in treating you and getting your symptoms under control, the slower the disease will progress. She spoke slowly and clearly. I'd like you to eat more foods with antioxidant and anti-inflammatory compounds, which is why I'm going to start making meals for you. I have a list prepared for your review, should you like to make some suggestions based on your personal preferences. Hermione offered her other parchment, and she accepted with tentative hands. I would like that, thank you. I offer no guarantees, but I'm learning about your condition as we go, which was something Narcissa knew. I'm nearly finished with creating your potions, but I've found that there are some ingredients whose benefits are enhanced by combining them with certain foods. And I am willing to make the necessary changes, however unconventional they may be. Which opened up a line of conversation that needed to happen. And the specialist. No. Narcissa's response was firm and unequivocal. Might I ask for a reason why? Studies show no muggles or their specialists. Narcissa spat the word as if it were poison. Then she fixed Hermione with a hard look of warning. If you cannot abide by my wishes, then I will find a healer who will. The statement made it clear who Narcissa believed was running the show, and while that might have worked with her primary healer, it would not work with her. Hermione made a casual gesture to her fireplace in a move that was purely to bait her. You are free to do as you please. I do have better things to do with my time than help someone who isn't willing to help themselves. Narcissa's face tightened with anger first, and Hermione readied herself for a fight, one of many, unless she took the out provided. But the argument never came. From one breath to the next, she visibly relaxed. A blankness swept over her pale features that was odd and alarming. They stared at each other in mutual confusion. Who are you? Realization jolted Hermione like a thunderclap, but she forced herself to remain calm, patient, understanding. My name is Hermione Granger. Hermione offered Narcissa a handkerchief to wipe her brow, staying her hand at the guards who were now fully paying attention. After she dabbed her hairline, Narcissa's eyes wandered around the room, focused as if she were trying to pick up clues. Her hands trembled, but not from the cold. Then her gaze fell back on Hermione, a twitch at the corner of her mouth as her jaw ticked. How did I get here? Hermione was smart enough to know when to fight and when prudence called for retreat. This required the latter. I'm your healer. This is my office. There was another pause, and Narcissa took several deep breaths as she placed her fingers on her temples, closing her eyes tight. With a small nod, she seemed to come back to herself, but was clearly still shaken by the empty space in her mind. Of course. Do carry on, Miss Granger. Carry on would have sent her back through the fireplace, per their previous argument, but Hermione wasn't cruel or unfeeling. The discussion could wait. It would have to. Would you like to pick up this conversation later? I am not invalid. She was completely back then, and surly from the moment of vulnerability. Of course not, Hermione replied thinly. How often does that happen? More than I would like. And for how long? Shortly after I was diagnosed. Was that before or after you picked up your new potions? Narcissa's lack of an answer was all Hermione needed to know. This treatment isn't going to be without its side effects, and you might not like them. The important thing is that you stick to the plan. And Hermione wasn't naive enough to believe that she wouldn't try to push. It was Narcissa Malfoy's way, stubborn and proud. She wasn't used to giving up any sort of control to anyone. Not anymore. Never again. Not if she could help it. No matter the reason or the cost. While compliant now, Hermione knew better than to believe that that would be the norm. After clearing her throat, she continued on with her expectations now that her patient seemed ready. I'd like for you to exercise. It will help with balance, which may reduce the chance for falls. Massages help increase circulation, so I recommend them. I'd also like to see where I can store your potions during the home visit to check out your kitchen capacities. I'll brew enough for a week to make sure they're as fresh as possible. I'll be sure to bring them with a list of what to take, when to take it, and how. I'll need to meet with your palliative care healers as well so that we are all on the same page. Narcissa nodded, her eyes falling on the forgotten list in front of her. Several minutes of silence passed before she seemed completely back to normal. Their imminent argument was forever lost. Hermione deleted it from her own mind, and the topic remained saved in a file for later. You've put a lot of thought into this, Miss Granger, and in such a short amount of time with the disease you are not familiar with. I know I am not the easiest patient you have encountered. A massive understatement. She cleared her throat in an attempt to not choke on the words, but Narcissa was sharp enough to read between the lines. However, I do thank you for taking my case seriously, despite our history. Once I commit to something, I don't let up. Remember that. Narcissa's blue eyes lifted to meet hers, and while it was so fleeting she might have missed it had she hesitated a second, Hermione caught a hint of respect in her stare. Far more than at the start of their conversation. Far more than expected, if she were being honest. But later, as Hermione hung more herbs to dry for later brews, she was reminded that just as every plant started as a seed, every person had to start somewhere as well. And there, in her office, on a Monday afternoon, seemed as good a spot as any for Narcissa Malfoy to start growing. April 6th, 2011. Hermione was actually dating someone important. Herself. On the second Wednesday of every month, she would take herself out. Most of the time, she went to theaters for productions, cinema for films of her choosing, ballet productions and concerts, and any other events she was interested in. Sometimes she would go for a walk in the park and marvel at the world around her, maybe take a book to read for the evening until it was too dark to see. She would buy herself gifts, little indulgences she never allowed herself to have, flowers, sweets. Other times, she would go to the market and buy everything she needed for a quiet night with an excellent meal and even better company. Herself. Most of her friends thought it was bizarre that she actually kept to her scheduled dates with herself, but Pansy and Parvati found it liberating and had started doing it as well. Ron would infrequently invite himself along, an invitation she always declined as that defeated the entire purpose of self-partnering. Dating herself had allowed Hermione to get in touch with what she expected from herself and potentially what she would need from an eventual partner. It allowed her to connect with herself, gave her the opportunity to improve her self-care habits, and gave herself a chance to fulfill her own desires without relying on someone else. In truth, Hermione wanted to take herself out more, but one day a week was all she could commit to at that time. Maybe it would change in the future, but for now, it worked. She'd skipped March and was determined to not do the same for April, but date night fell on possibly the worst day imaginable. It started with a storm the previous night that had shattered a glass pane in her greenhouse. The magical repair had gone quickly, but it had thrown her morning gardening schedule awry. Then, Theo's name suddenly appeared on her calendar for an emergency meeting, but he'd neglected to mention the fact that she would be walking into a trap named Roger Davies. "You poached my patient!" There was no point in lying about something she'd done intentionally. "I did." For a breath, Roger faltered, staring at her, flummoxed by her blunt admission. His mood shifted from astonishment to self-righteous anger. "I never thought you were capable of something like this. Of all people, Hermione, I thought you operated on a higher moral plane, one where you don't go behind a colleague's back and snatch their patient. A patient, might I add, that you declined. It's uncouth, unprofessional, and—" Hermione stopped listening in favor of letting her eyes drift to Theo. To the casual observer, he appeared exceedingly detached from what was happening in his office, which was exactly the attitude he attempted to convey. She knew better. There was a glint in his eyes that spoke just how vastly entertained Theo was by Roger's rant. Hermione also caught him chuckling into his tea, not intending on stopping him. Theo's lack of response meant only one thing. He was testing her. Sometimes he did it out of boredom, but mostly it was for his own amusement, as he had a bit of a god complex that stemmed from being the most observant person in any room. Theo loved to see people squirm. Well, mainly Hermione, because for the most part she was unflappable. He also liked to test her because, no matter how many offers she had refused, he hadn't let go of the belief that Hermione would one day run the ministry. And even though he was wrong as hell, Hermione had never failed an exam in her life, and she certainly wasn't going to start then. So she took his test, and marveled at how effortlessly it was to achieve top marks. Easy because she had already prepared for Roger. He'd been a blip on her radar when she'd taken Narcissa's case. Small in the grand scheme of things. Knowing he wouldn't take too kindly to the theft, Hermione had already prepared a little speech that played into the things Roger valued most, his work and his ego. Narcissa Malfoy needs to begin treatment immediately, rather than in a few months while you run tests to determine where her disease originates. Its progression is too rapid for you to waste time. "That's insulting that you don't think—" Hermione narrowed her eyes at him. "Do you know what would happen if Narcissa Malfoy, or even Draco, got any sort of inkling that your treatment delays had cost her the time she wanted with her family?" The threat was partially empty, but not one he was willing to test if the look on his face meant anything. Silence fell in Theo's office, and Hermione used it to hammer that thought home. The liability exposure alone would dismantle your career and put all of your research into question, Roger. So, yes, I accepted her case. She folded her arms across her chest, face pinched. And I broke my own rules to do it. I hope that your ego won't blind you into seeing that I've done you a massive favor to protect our department and our work as a whole. Oh, and you. Roger rubbed the back of his neck, as most of the men in her life did when they felt guilty. I didn't see it that way. Still, he was earnest when he apologized for calling her in for the unscheduled meeting, his cheeks a touch pink. "I'll still review her file, if you'll provide a copy, and should you need assistance, I'll make myself available. I'd still like to research her family history as well." "I can handle that when I'm settled into treating her." "Very well, then." He glanced at his watch. "I have a meeting." When Roger left, Theo placed his teacup on the saucer and stood tall. He fixed his cufflinks first, before running a hand down his white shirt, smoothing his navy tie and straightening any creases. "Nicely done." The fact that he looked fit didn't stop Hermione from glaring at the smirking wizard. "A warning next time would be appreciated." The expression on Theo's face told her that was never going to happen. In fact, she was about to tell him where he could go when there was a knock on the door. Padma stuck her head in surprise, but happy to see Hermione. "I need help." The task ended up taking 3 hours, an exhausting number of tests, and finally the diagnosis: powdered silver poisoning, when she found the bite mark that caused Padma to make the call to report a newly made werewolf. By the time Padma had finished recommending a good therapist and the ministry launched their investigation into how they'd been bitten, it was well after 4, and Hermione only had an hour until her meeting with Narcissa and her current healers. It was date night, and Hermione was planning to take herself to a show in the city that started at 8. After several calculations, she realized she wouldn't make it on time unless she left from the Malfoys' home, which was how Hermione ended up in their spacious kitchen on a Thursday evening, dressed for a night out in a dark green lace cocktail dress and nude heels. Her long hair was tamed into soft curls with the help of more than a little sleek-easies. When she'd stepped out of the flue, Narcissa had given her the first approving look in their brief association. They convened at a long walnut kitchen table that was larger than her dining table. Hermione had laid out her Narcissa's treatment plan, her research department, and the potions she had been brewing the night before. They were separated into morning, afternoon, and evening, 9 in total. Narcissa's palliative care healers, Keating and Sachs, she never bothered with first names, sat across from her. As far as she knew, they came once every few days and accompanied her to events as members of her staff. Those roles would have to change over the coming months and years. They quietly read over her detailed instructions regarding Narcissa's potion regime and meal plan. Narcissa was flipping through her copy of everything, oddly quiet with no complaints, but she put observing the witch aside in favor of assessing her private healers. With her mouth flattened into a line, Hermione's initial assessment deemed them perfectly adequate healers. Nothing particularly special. They were older than Hermione, but younger than Narcissa, nondescript like most private healers, with forgettable features, but neither had any desire to stand out. They were everything they needed to be, capable of following instruction, and talented enough to do their job. They were, however, boldly loyal to Narcissa, and Hermione had no way of determining if that would be an advantage or a detriment. What she did know was that they were obviously skeptical of Hermione's presence, and her treatment plan. "Healer Granger," Sachs spoke up after Hermione asked if there were any questions. "This is an extensive list of potions. How do you know they won't counteract one another?" The answer was simple. She'd done her damn job, but what she actually said was, "It's my specialty," and left it at that. Narcissa coughed delicately. Keating picked up the second in the line of 9 vials that had laid out to show what they looked like. "And you want her to take—" "The schedule is clear," Hermione maintained a professional tone. "It says here that you'll be providing meals," Sachs pointed out. "I will. 1 meal a day for now, starting tomorrow." Truthfully, she hadn't had the energy to prepare her meals and brew potions. They were all unfamiliar recipes she had never attempted before, and thus the task of brewing had taken longer than she'd expected. Probably not her best work, but she still had not made a mistake. "I don't understand why the house elves can't prepare all of her meals anymore." Patiently, Hermione gestured to the carefully folded parchments that she'd made for them both to study. "Please review my research as it answers all the questions you may have. You may call me with any additional inquiries you may have or anything to add to my research. I would like the next 30 days to monitor Narcissa, exclusively. But once that time passes, I expect you both to return to your normal schedules. Enjoy your holidays." "Paid," Narcissa added. The 2 witches shook their head, both pleased by the sudden vacation and their boss's generosity. "That's all I have for today." Hermione gave them both a smile. "I look forward to working with you both." Handshakes were exchanged before they both gathered their rolls of parchment and left. "You do not seem fond of my healers, Miss Granger." Hermione honestly didn't have an opinion of them just yet. Just an evaluation that could, and likely would, be adjusted with further interactions as she got to know them both better as healers and people. I generally work alone, so it will be different, but not in a bad way, as their presence would make it possible for Hermione to have a life outside of working and brewing once things worsened. There was still the bit about their loyalties that made Hermione worry. How long have they been employed by your family? They cared for Astoria for the duration of her illness. They are trained for terminal care. Ah, years then. Loyalty might be an issue should Narcissa stray from the treatment plan. It didn't look like either had the fortitude to stand up to the older witch, which would be a problem if she decided to stop complying. And judging from Hermione's research into personality changes that occurred during the duration of the disease, that was likely. Not completely on purpose, though. Well, the fact that the Malfoys likely had a house elf was positive. Should anything happen, Hermione would be alerted. Speaking of elves, Hermione scanned the room with slightly furrowed brows. The last thing she'd done before quitting the ministry was swaying the Wizengamot to vote in favor of their emancipation, which had caused quite the stir-up amongst the families wealthy enough to have the beings passed along generationally. With the new law, families were required to set them free and provide them an option for rehiring, paid and provided with livable conditions. Furthermore, extensive documentation had to be provided to the ministry before any family was allowed to retrain an elf. The ministry did check for undocumented house elves. The Aurors would be called in if the beast or being division had any trouble. The fines and public shame alone were not worth breaking the rules. Hermione had even started the plans to set up a small sanctuary in Scotland for them to live free of servitude, but allowed to come and go as they pleased for work, should they decide not to live with the family. She wondered if the plan had lived on. "Miss Granger," Narcissa spoke up for the first time, "if you are looking for our house elf, we only employ one part-time, as Draco feels this house is too small for a full staff. He mainly does the cleaning and helps with Scorpius' evening plans." Hermione hadn't had an opportunity to explore their home, but based off the kitchen and the adjacent living room alone, she seriously doubted the Malfoys would willingly live anywhere that could be considered small. It was oddly modern in design for such a traditional family, so much was disrupting her perception of them. It was to the point where Narcissa, in her plum dress robes, staple necklace with the gold band, and hair styled under her matching fancy hat, seemed almost out of place and too old-fashioned, while she sat next to Hermione at the head of the table. The area itself was clean, open, and bright, with windows, plenty of light, white walls, light wood flooring that offset the dark-colored cabinets in the kitchen, and the granite counters that matched the waterfall island. The living room had dark gray sofas with a coffee table between them, and all adequately spaced away from the fireplace she'd stepped out of over 30 minutes before. Artwork was tastefully spaced throughout the space, and Hermione saw more leading up the stairs on the other side of the room. She knew Narcissa hadn't designed it. Also, there were a lot of pansies decor staples present in the room, but it didn't explain how modern it was, and she found herself wondering. "Zippy!" Narcissa called politely, and the free house elf materialized next to her, wearing a black bow tie and looking quite healthy. "Yes, mistress." "This is Miss Hermione Granger." Hermione gave a courteous nod at the elf, who stared at her with large eyes and filled with recognition and admiration. Narcissa continued on. "She will be tending to me along with Keating and Sax. You are to do as she instructs, as if she were a member of this family." "It will be an honor." Narcissa eyed the smaller creature before her eyes slid to Hermione. "Thank you, Zippy. Now, please update me on Scorpius's progression through his schedule." "Young master has finished etiquette. Miss Pritchard will dress him in proper dinner attire, and he will be ready shortly. Master Draco will have no need for me. I will go home." "Thank you. Enjoy your holiday." Zippy gave another reverent nod and vanished with a snap of his fingers. Hermione officially found herself baffled on so many levels that she wasn't even going to try and point them all out, because she didn't want to confuse herself any further. Not only was that a bad feeling, it was a completely foreign concept for her. But what made matters worse was that even though Hermione tried not to think about it, she found that it was like trying not to breathe. Very soon, the strain would become so great and she had to take a desperate breath. Which was exactly what happened. Her thoughts ran wild. First, Zippy was oddly well-spoken for a house elf, better than Creature, reverent, as most were the families that they worked for, but he worked part-time, had a home away, and days off. That alone was enough of a shock to last her for a long time. but it just continued. Not about the house elf, but etiquette lessons for a 5-year-old. Ginny had a tough time getting Al through a meal without getting food on his clothes, much less using the correct cutlery while doing it. Blessedly, after that, the wheels in her brain slowed long enough for her to catch her breath and spit out her last 2 topics of confusion: their modern home and, hell, them. She couldn't muster up much of an analysis on either. That would take her time. Loads of it. And a whiteboard. Hermione only realized she was broadcasting very loudly in the silence that followed Zippy's departure when she noticed that Narcissa was regarding her with a challenging look. Her head was cocked to the side, already prepared for another skirmish. To be fair, discussions that occurred due to their conflicting philosophies seemed almost normal, even after only a couple of interactions. It was not as professional as she'd like, but better than one could hope for given the amount of time they would be spending in each other's company. Hermione had a rule. She only played defense, never offense. She left that to Narcissa, who played so well it begged to wonder if the witch was only asking her pointed questions to test her boundaries and limits, poking and prodding to see how much Hermione could take before she reached her limit and snapped. It was normal. Every patient tried, but none had succeeded. Best they got this part over with. "Tell me, Miss Granger, were you expecting something different from the house elf?" Based on her affronted tone, her tense body language, and the narrowed look of her barely concealed irritation on her face, Hermione knew better than to answer that question as forthrightly as otherwise she would have. She looked more inclined to start a war than make peace. "I look forward to working with him." It was the wrong response. Narcissa folded the parchment with her treatment plans. "I know that my family does not have the best reputation for treating elves with respect." Another one of those understatements, to say the least. "However, I assure you that Zippy is treated fairly, paid hourly wages, has holiday time, is healthy, and is free. He is not bound to my family, and he also works for the Greengrass family. Times have changed, Miss Granger." "They have," Hermione agreed with a slight nod. But because she couldn't help herself, she had to point out a key counter to her argument. "By law." Narcissa didn't flinch, but dug her sanctimonious heels in further. "Be that as it may, it still should speak for itself that we are abiding by said law. There are always ways to circumvent any rule." Of course, Narcissa would know that better than anyone. "True, but the alternative would bring unwanted attention to your family, attention that you don't need if you want to maintain the place you've worked so hard to regain in society, which seemed to be important to you. So your compliance is a tactical avenue, and therefore means little to me." Hermione paused, but reluctantly gave her a bit of credit. "It is nice to see, however." No words were exchanged for several moments. Hermione stood gathering the 9 potion vials she had placed on the table earlier, and sliding them in with the others in the wicker basket she'd brought with her. Then she went to search for a place to store the vials. Narcissa's eyes were on her the entire time as she placed the basket on the countertop and stepped back to eye the long row of walnut cabinets. The open cabinets were lined with decorative kitchen items. Hermione opened the door in front of her. Glass, cups, teacups. She closed it. "Miss Granger?" The older witch's tone was thoughtful. It sounded like she had been contemplating whatever she was about to say for a while. Hermione remained silent, allowing her to continue. "I have noticed in our interactions that you are very opinionated, and you do so little to censor yourself." "Touché." Narcissa gave a flippant wave of her dainty hand. "At my age, I believe I have earned the right to speak my mind, wouldn't you say?" "You do have that right, just as I have a right to speak mine. Age doesn't mean you have a free pass, nor does it mean you're exempt from being held accountable for your words and actions. I mean no offense, of course. I am just getting to know you better, since we are bound to be around each other for the foreseeable future." Narcissa cleared her throat as she wanted to say more, but stopped herself. Hermione glanced over her shoulder at her, eyebrow raised expectantly. "Go on." Narcissa's eyes were slightly narrowed in a manner that meant she was ready to keep pushing. Hermione welcomed the challenge with a rather bored expression. "It's just that during our interactions, I have noticed a few things. You are Draco's age, yes?" "From what I remember, I'm nearly a year older. I'll be 32 in September." "Are you married?" "No." "Divorced?" There was an antiquated disgust in her tone at the word. "No." "Engaged?" No, I'm single. For years, I imagine, The question sounded innocent, but there was something patronizing beneath it. Your lack of response means that the answer is yes, something I find interesting. Narcissa touched her chin, appearing thoughtful. Then she ran her fingers over the necklace that often seemed to clash with her attire, but she wore it regardless. That you are unmarried at your age makes sense in a way. Your uncompromising attitude is unbecoming of a woman who seeks to marry. Not everyone wants to marry. She leveled Hermione with a knowing look. You are quite liberal, Miss Granger. And it was the same tone someone very rich would use to call another person very poor. However, you are a woman, and it is in our very nature to want to marry, raise a family, settle down, and be a wife. There were two vastly different opinions competing for dominance in Hermione's head. The first was the bothersome truth that Narcissa wasn't wrong. Hermione had toyed around with the idea of really committing to building a life with someone and having children of her own, but it hadn't worked. And if she were being perfectly honest with herself, after Ron, she'd never given it an honest try. However, the second idea was louder, more rankled by the fact that Narcissa's comment was completely off the mark. Hermione was indeed a woman, while she wouldn't judge anyone who wanted to go that route, because it was their choice. She had more lofty aspirations than only being a wife, married for the sole purpose to breed. Hermione was a professional, and Narcissa was her patient. She refused to let the witch provoke her, so in lieu of a response, she continued searching for a cabinet to store her weekly potions, and while she opened and shut various cabinets down the row, she formulated at least 17 responses in her head, because one wasn't enough. The upper corner cabinet is empty and will do just fine. Of course, Narcissa was correct. It was her home, after all. As Hermione started carefully placing the labeled vials in rows and organizing them, Mrs. Malfoy delicately cleared her throat as if she were about to address a captive audience. If her voice had been a little higher in pitch, she would have reminded her of Umbridge. Hermione, already slightly flustered from having to censor herself, tensed before she realized she'd done so. Then she gritted her teeth. Yes? I confess I am intrigued by you, Miss Granger. She wasn't certain if that was a good or bad thing, but decided it best if she said nothing, and allowed the witch to continue uninterrupted. You remind me a lot of myself, and because of that, I have decided to give you a bit of friendly advice. Just a little something my mother once said to me. Hermione ignored the way the witch's drawled words made her feel like a rat who had learned how to push a button without being trained. I am not accustomed to your culture, Miss Granger, but wizards do not want a witch that emasculates them. They have no interest in a witch who will challenge them in every aspect, someone too capable of taking care of herself, too used to being alone. Wizards want to be needed, adored, catered to. They want to lead and not be led. Even if you have to fake it, Miss Granger, I suggest you learn to do that if you ever hope to marry. Hermione paused halfway between placing the last of her morning potions in a neat row on the shelf, as she decided on whether to respond or pretend like she hadn't heard a thing. It wasn't the first time someone had said that to her, so it didn't grate on her like it would have in any other situation. In fact, Hermione silently thanked Mrs. Weasley, who, during all their little talks when she was dating Ron, had unwittingly prepared her for the current situation, right down to her response. Yes, response, because she could no longer hold her peace, not when it had been so thoroughly disrupted. It simply wasn't in her nature. Hermione placed the vial on the shelf and continued working, finishing the last of the morning vials before she inhaled, exhaled, and summoned a chill in her voice that even she hadn't expected. That's the difference between us, I suppose. Oh, Narcissa sounded intrigued. A moment of silence passed between them as Hermione started on the afternoon vials, still facing away. Unlike you, I won't fake it or play a role just to appeal or to appease a man. Yes, man, because wizards are men first and foremost. There is no distinction between the two. If a man wants me, he'll want me as I am now, and he'll want who I will become. I'm constantly growing and changing, just as I expect he will be. He won't be intimidated or emasculated by my power, or me, because the man I choose will be just that, a man, not an insecure child. She exhaled, trying to force the keyed-up energy that accompanied her words to pass. But it didn't. The man I choose will be secure in himself and the roles that we will play in each other's lives. And when I cater to him, it won't be because I'm appealing to his ego, but because I want to. Because I love and respect him and what we share. When he chooses to lead, I'll follow, not blindly or as an act of appeasement, but by choice. Before anything else, we are partners, which means I'll trust him not to make decisions that will affect us both jointly and individually without consulting me first. It will be our duty to each other, and Draco, how long have you been standing there? It happened in a series of blunders that, had Hermione been more cognizant about what was going on around her and not in a full-on rant mode, might have been avoided. It started with the wind instantly vanishing from the sails of her argument, the energy behind her fervent words just as dead on the water as they were in her throat. Then she lost her footing, both figuratively and literally, as her heel lost its grip, skidding out from under her. Narcissa's loud gasp was all she heard when she only just managed to keep a vial safe and not ruin a night's worth of hard work by catching herself with her elbows on the counter. "Miss Granger, are you all right?" At least Narcissa had the decency to sound startled and worried. "I'm quite all right." Hermione pulled herself back up and resumed her task. Nothing to see, of course. Her ankle hurt almost as much as her pride, but she would rather break the other one than admit it. "Just going to finish up here and head out. I'll be back in the morning with your meals." "Are you certain?" "I'm fine." And because that sounded too flustered and sharp, Hermione tried again, still with her back to them. Thank you for your concern, but I am perfectly well." The silence that followed was as long as it was deafening. She could almost feel their eyes on her, observing. She felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, but Hermione took her time and composed herself as she continued placing the vials of potions on the shelf, noticing she was running low on excuses not to turn around. Hermione was immediately relieved when Narcissa started talking to her son. "How long have you been home, Draco?" "Not long. How was Scorpius today?" The first thing Hermione noticed was that he sounded older. A thought she found silly because, of course, he did. They were adults now, no longer scared children on opposing sides of a war. It made sense that his voice was different, that his pitch had deepened to a lower, more confident, more rich tenor. He still sounded posh, something that would likely never change, but Hermione found it oddly comforting. It was reassuring to know that while some things could change, there were still constants in human nature. "He was well behaved, and there were no incidents. Not that you need to worry." The phrasing made Hermione pause and tilt her head in question, before she pushed the twinge of curiosity aside in favor of continuing her task. She had another 10 minutes until she needed to leave in order to make it to the theater in time for the show, but the tension in the room had spiked so high she knew better than to draw any attention to herself, or her hurt ankle. "Good." He spoke quietly, but there was a sharp quality to his voice. Then he took an audible breath, and Hermione carefully clinked 2 vials together to hide the fact that she was listening. "Where is he?" There was a tinge of something there that she couldn't define. "I am taking him to dinner at the Greengrass estate," Narcissa told him coolly. "I assume you will be working late again." "That is correct." Another silence fell, but it didn't last nearly as long. "Please shave that ghastly facial hair off your face. I have scheduled a marriage meeting with the elder sire, sister. She's 25 now, and while I feel that is old, you—" "Cancel it." Malfoy's tone was clipped with a sort of finality that Hermione understood. The conversation was over. "I'll be working in my office tonight." "You could at least show your face at dinner with—" "No." His response sounded decisive, but also churlish. "Enjoy your evening." The silence was brief, almost awkward. "I know Scorpius comes to sit in your office when he is put to bed. Do not keep him up late, Draco. He has a schedule to keep. The nanny says that he has been grouchy in the mornings lately." "What would you have me do, Mother?" There was a brittle pause. "Would you have me turn him away?" The question was hollow, empty. "Draco, I think we're finished here." Hermione was still facing away from them, but the tension that lingered was loud, angry, and visceral. But that strain was mostly coming from Malfoy, tangible enough that she thought she could reach out and touch it. She wouldn't, though. She knew better. She might have seemed controlled as Malfoy's tone, but something had inherently volatile would surely explode with only the slightest bit of carelessness. The sound of Narcissa moving reached her ears, just before she heard her heels connect with the hardwood floor. "Is that all for today, Miss Granger?" There was a twinge of exhaustion in Narcissa's voice that hadn't been there earlier. "I have another engagement to attend." "Yes," Hermione answered, but only after a small delay as she tried, for the sake of propriety, not to appear as though she was eavesdropping, which she was. But honestly, how could they expect anyone not to listen? Hermione was nosy, too much so for her own good, but with a healthy and almost insatiable thirst for knowledge in any form, even when it didn't pertain to her. Having an almost cryptic conversation in her presence was like placing a glass of fire whiskey in front of an alcoholic and telling them not to drink. It was an impossible task. When she considered it, Hermione arrived at an excellent question. Could it be considered eavesdropping when they were speaking so freely in front of her? No. She cleared her throat. "I'll finish here and see you in the morning." "Very well." Hermione heard Narcissa's heels click across the hardwood floor, echoing as she walked away with measured steps. Narcissa paused once for several breaths, then continued on, her footsteps fading into nothing. Hermione almost relaxed and placed the last of the vials on the shelf, but then remembered something important. She wasn't alone. Well, Hermione supposed it would happen at some point. She shut the cabinet and carefully turned around, keeping her eyes on the floor in an attempt to mind her aching ankle. She turned in a slow circle, bracing her hands on the edge of the granite countertop as she lifted her gaze to the remaining Malfoy across the room, partially obscured by the island between them. Despite Pravarti's recent rantings about Malfoy being climbable, for the last year and a half, Hermione had been listening to Harry vocalize his grievances about the man's behavior and character. His complaints, coupled with how she remembered him at school and his trial, had created a detailed picture in Hermione's head of what he was supposed to look like. A thin, pale, sneering prat with cold gray eyes who wore his hair long like his father's, he sought to emulate. But the real version wasn't anywhere close to that. Except for his attitude. Malfoy had never been described as ugly, so that fact hadn't changed in 13 years. If anything, the passage of time had only served to make him more aesthetically pleasing, which was a thought so patently ridiculous that Hermione rejected it instantly. For good measure, she then had the banned notion burned, the ashes swept up into a neat pile and binned. However, sweeping always left a bit of residue, but not enough to matter. Malfoy was taller than she remembered, perhaps a head taller than Harry, still lean and pale, but not in the hollow and almost translucent way he'd looked after living through the hell of having Voldemort as a murderous houseguest. He looked stronger, serious, poised. He stood taller, far more confident. Hermione figured that had come with age because Malfoy had matured, at least physically. Time, and a bit of facial hair, had made his boyish features taut, sharper, and more defined, but not so refined that he looked like his father. On that note, Malfoy wore his blonde hair, not long like other pure-blood men, but short and parted to the right, combed into a pompadour style that suited him. He was walking towards her. The sound of his shoes on the wood floor was loud in the silence. Hermione never averted her eyes, aware that she was staring boldly at him, but he returned her gaze with one of his own, gray eyes unreadable, except for a twitch in his jaw and a glimmer of what looked like an odd mix of curiosity and suspicion as he stopped on the opposite end of the kitchen. The way they stood now, facing each other with no island between them, felt as they were readying for a duel. It made her pulse quicken, made her ready to fight. Her wand hand itched to feel her trusty vinewood in its grasp, but it was tucked in her beaded bag on the island, exactly halfway in between them. Hermione pushed herself off the counter, walking normally, confidently, despite the stabbing pain in her ankle. She stopped at the bag, took her eyes off him long enough to pick it up. She cut her eyes back to the man who hadn't moved a muscle, noting little things, the way he stood, the signet ring on his right hand, the way he watched her like a chess master watched his opponent's moves. But mostly Hermione noticed his body language, which was relaxed in a way that was completely at odds with the intensity that rolled off of him. She had to say something. The air between them was too taut to remain silent, so Hermione opted for the simple. His name. Malfoy? When he said nothing in response, she searched his face for a hint of reaction, but saw nothing discernible. except for the flip of a switch and the moment he stopped looking and started seeing her. The weight of his gaze was unsettling and uncomfortable, but Hermione fought off those feelings and tilted her head in defiance. She hardly recognized herself in this scenario, where she should have had plenty to say, yet found herself unable to speak. But then his eyes cut from her feet to her face so fast that she almost missed it. Hermione did not, however, miss the fact that in just one look, Malfoy had assessed her almost as completely as she had him. A quick glance at the wall clock behind him, coupled with a strange little jolt, told her that it was time to go. Hermione turned on her heels, making sure to keep the pain off her face and out of her gait, and she walked away. Careful steps, but not too careful. She felt his eyes on her like pinpricks. It only made her want to leave quicker. Her exit strategy was nearly a success when she heard him say one word. Her name. Granger. It took until intermission for Hermione to realize that something else had changed about him. Malfoy hadn't said her name like a curse, or a filthy word that he had to spit out of his mouth. It sounded like a riddle, one he intended to solve. The beginning of wisdom is to call things by their right names. Proverb